This is Europe, this is Scandinavia, and these are the Faroe Islands, an archipelago in the East Atlantic Ocean situated between the United Kingdom and Iceland, and currently an overseas territory of Denmark. Its capital city is Tórshavn, which comes from Old Norse and means Thor's Haven, which should probably give you a clue as to who the Faroese are descended from. The Faroe Islands have a population of around 53,000, as well as a unique history, culture, language, and pretty much all of the staples of an independent country. They even have their own currency, the Faroese krone, which itself is a different variation of the Danish krone, and is issued and controlled by the Danish National Bank. The official language of the Faroe Islands is Faroese, a North Germanic language, and is in fact the closest living relative to Old Norse besides Icelandic. But given the Faroe Islands' status as an overseas territory of Denmark, the Danish language also shares equal status with Faroese when it comes to official affairs, as well as being taught in Faroese schools. Though interestingly enough, Faroese is mutually unintelligible with both Danish and Icelandic, or any other North Germanic language. However, the first people to reach the Faroe Islands spoke none of these languages and were in fact from Ireland. In the 7th century AD, Irish monks arrived on the islands and settled in small monastic villages. It's thought that perhaps the reason they came to the faraway and isolated Faroe Islands was to become closer to God, but it's also very likely that they had the added goal of expanding the Roman influence of Christianity. But their presence on the islands came to an end already in the 9th century when Norse peasants and farmers, otherwise known as Vikings, began immigrating to the Faroe Islands from Norway. Some were looking for arable land, while others were purportedly escaping from the supposed tyranny of King Harald Fairhair, the first person to successfully unite the petty Norwegian kingdoms under a single monarch. The Vikings from Norway now began to found their own settlements in the Faroe Islands, and the Vikings, being Vikings, expelled the Irish monks from the islands and established them as their own territory. These are the same Vikings that the Faroese would later descend from. Independent Viking rule in the Faroe Islands lasted for about as long as the Irish monks' presence on them did, from the early 9th century to the early 11th century. During this time, however, the Vikings, who brought with them the religious beliefs, customs, and politics, managed to lay the foundation for the historical model of the Faroese government, which lives on to this day. The center of this government was founded in the early 10th century and is one of the earliest examples of a parliamentary system in Europe, the Lagting, literally the law thing. In fact, some would actually consider it to be the oldest parliament in Europe and the world for that matter. The Lagting was situated in Tórshavn and served as the legislative and judicial center for all the islands and their inhabitants. In the beginning, all yeomen, that is, landowning male citizens, could have a say in the policy making in the Faroe Islands. So, if there were say 100 men who had their own land living in the Faroe Islands, there would be 100 men with a vote in the Lagting to decide on all governmental affairs on the islands. But this was later changed in the late 13th century when the pool of eligible policymakers was decreased from all male citizens with land to just 36 who were specially chosen to make decisions on behalf of everybody else in the country. While establishing one of Europe's earliest parliamentary structures is certainly impressive, the Faroe Islands weren't the only ones to do so. In fact, they weren't even the only ones to do it in the same century that the Lagting was founded in. For example, soon after the Vikings on the Faroe Islands established the Lagting, other Viking settlers in Iceland formed the Althing, also in the early 10th century. In fact, the Lagting in the Faroe Islands was originally an Althing as well, until the aforementioned reforms in the 13th century. In addition, there's also the Storting in Norway, founded in 1814, which also happens to be one of the most significant years in Norway's history for reasons we'll get into later, and the Folketing in Denmark, founded in 1849. The common stem in all these names, ting or thing, was originally an old term used in Germanic languages that referred to an assembly, meeting, or discussion. In the case of English, for instance, it was only by Middle English from the 11th to 16th centuries that thing started being used to denote an object. The evolution of the word thing is also similar in many other Germanic languages, such as thing in German, which also now means thing. But anyway, back to the Vikings. As the Vikings were establishing their own system of government on the Faroe Islands, they maintained contact and trade with the Norwegian mainland. The Faroes exported woolen products, dried fish, and other goods that were abundant on the Faroe Islands to Norway, while they imported things that were otherwise difficult to obtain on the islands. Examples of imported goods from Norway to the Faroe Islands included necessities such as timber for making ships, corn and soapstone, as well as luxury items like glass, amber beads, and hazelnuts. However, in the late 10th century, Norway would begin exporting something far more significant to the Faroe Islands, their new religion. We're of course talking about the spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. You see, the Vikings were originally pagans who had brought their Old Norse religious beliefs and practices with them to the Faroe Islands, and for nearly 2 centuries these Old Norse pagan beliefs remained the norm in the islands. But this was all about to change thanks to a man named Sigmund Brestisson, his supporters, and the first Christian king of Norway, Olav Tryggvason, or Olav I. Initially, Brestisson was born into a politically influential and relatively well-off family in the southern Faroe Islands in 961, specifically on the island of Skúvoy. Unfortunately though, very early on, his life took a drastic turn for the worse when, as a young teenager, he found himself sold into slavery after having borne witness to the slaughter of many of his southern Faroese kinsmen, either at the hands of the northern Faroese or other invaders from Scandinavia. After these traumatic events, Brestisson was sent to the Norwegian mainland as a slave, where he served the last pagan ruler of Norway, Håkon Jarl, or Håkon the Great. In 995, however, Håkon was ousted from power and killed by one of his own slaves, though not Brestisson, and was replaced by Olaf Tryggvason, who took the Norwegian throne as King Olaf I Tryggvason, the first Christian king of Norway. Although Tryggvason was born in Norway, up until recently, he had been living in England, where he participated in several Viking raids in the country. But soon after hearing about the revolt against Håkon, Tryggvason made the trek to Norway, where he became king after Håkon was murdered. Upon ascending to the Norwegian throne, he immediately began Christianizing all the areas under his control. As you can probably already tell, Tryggvason, unlike Håkon, was a devoutly Christian man whose goal it was to spread Christianity to the rest of his kingdom and throughout the greater Viking realm where Christianity hadn't already been accepted. This included converting the Faroe Islands, of course, and Tryggvason had just the man for the job, Sigmundur Brestisson. Up until this point, Brestisson wasn't particularly a Christian man. In fact, he was more inclined to stick to traditional Norse mythology and paganism. For example, an account from Færinga Saga, the Faroe saga, which comes to us from an unknown author from Viking Age Iceland, tells how Brestisson had once asked Håkon for advice on how he could avenge his dead father, who had been killed when Brestisson was still just a teenager on the Faroe Islands. Håkon told him that he should put his faith in the old ways, meaning Norse paganism. Håkon then brought Brestisson to a house in the forest, where a woman, also a believer in the old ways, adorned him with a golden armband, which was supposed to grant Brestisson good luck. It was also implied that this good luck would help Brestisson enact revenge on his father's killers in the Faroe Islands. But of course, not long after, as Håkon's story came to an end, Tryggvason was just hitting his stride, becoming the new king of Norway, and as mentioned before, he had a couple of important tasks for Brestisson. Tryggvason summoned Brestisson to his court, where he gave him the mission of returning to the Faroe Islands to convert the local population to Christianity, as well as bringing the islands into the Norwegian fold. Tryggvason was determined to spread his newfound faith and start collecting taxes from the islands. Upon being given this task, Brestisson returned to the Faroe Islands and held an assembly at the Althing, the future Luchting, or simply Thing as some sources refer to it, located in Tórshavn, where he announced Tryggvason's decree in front of the crowd of yeomen and everybody else that was gathered there. Unfortunately for Brestisson, though perhaps not surprisingly, many weren't happy with this new decree about adopting a new religion and relinquishing the Faroes' independence to Norway. A large group of Faroese even chased away Brestisson and his supporters after he had finished reading the decree. It was clear that Brestisson would have to contend with the local pagans and traditionalists on the islands. Perhaps the most noteworthy defender of traditional Old Norse paganism during this time was the Viking chieftain Thrandur. In fact, Guttu's staunch opposition to the conversion of the Faroe Islands to Christianity was so fierce that, to this day, his name can be used in Icelandic to refer to somebody who is being difficult or obstructive. The phrase can be used as being someone's Thrandur, vera einhverjum Thrandur, or just being a Thrandur í Guttu, að vera Thrandur í Guttu. But Brestisson had an idea on how to deal with Guttu and his stubbornness. In another account that also comes to us from the Faroe saga, one night, Brestisson and a group of his supporters snuck into Guttu's house and then crept into his bedroom. There they found Guttu sleeping in his bed, and after slowly waking him up, they threatened him at knife point with an ultimatum: either convert to Christianity or be killed. Guttu agreed to convert, and his life was spared. And with that, Christianity had taken a foothold on the Faroe Islands, officially becoming the state religion in 999. Although it would still be centuries until the Old Norse pagan beliefs became just a negligible minority. As for the other part of the decree, the Faroe Islands becoming a part of the Kingdom of Norway, this wouldn't take place until 1035 upon Guttu's death at the ripe old age of 90, making him the last pagan ruler of the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands' strongest proponent of traditional Norse paganism and Faroese independence was dead, leaving the Faroe Islands to be officially incorporated into the Kingdom of Norway as a Norwegian province. From this point on into the 19th century, the Faroes remained under Norwegian sovereignty. This remained true even when Norway joined with Denmark to form a union under a single monarch in 1380, and again when Norway and Denmark then joined together with Sweden in 1397 to form the Kalmar Union. While the latter Kalmar Union would disintegrate after a Swedish rebellion in 1523, the union between Denmark and Norway, or the Twin Kingdoms, would remain strong until the 19th century. Although historians refer to them as twins, Denmark and Norway were not equal. During this time, Denmark continuously consolidated more and more power and influence within the Union until Norway effectively was transformed into a Danish territory. Norway still retained some domestic and administrative power over itself and its dependencies, i.e. the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, but for all intents and purposes, Norway had become a Danish puppet state. In the end, it was the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars that would ultimately decide the fate of the Faroe Islands and the rest of Denmark-Norway. During the prelude to the Napoleonic Wars in 1794, Denmark, still conjoined with Norway, had initially joined with Sweden in an alliance of armed neutrality to protect its shipping routes in the Baltic Sea. This was all well and good until Prussia and Russia joined the same alliance in 1800. The problem occurred because Britain, who at the time was at war with France, perceived the new additions to the alliance as an act of aggression, and in 1801 retaliated by sending a naval fleet to Copenhagen to put an end to the alliance. When negotiations failed, the British Navy began bombarding the opposing Danish Navy. Within the course of a few hours, the Danes would open up negotiations with the British again, and an armistice was reached, putting an end to the alliance of armed neutrality and hostilities between the two nations for a time. But as the wars progressed and Napoleon was steadily gaining more ground in Europe, the British returned to Copenhagen once more in 1807 to neutralize the potential threat of a combined Danish and French navy, and the Second Battle of Copenhagen began. This time, not only the Danish navy, but the city of Copenhagen itself was subjected to bombardment from the British, eventually leading to massive civilian casualties and causing the Danes to surrender just a few weeks later. In response to this resounding defeat, Denmark, along with Norway and all its territories, joined with France and its allies in an alliance against Britain and its allies. But this new arrangement wouldn't even last until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, not long before Napoleon was deposed as Emperor of France for the first time, Denmark and Sweden signed the Treaty of Kiel, ending hostilities between the two Baltic nations that had found themselves on opposing sides of the recent wars in Europe. In addition to pulling out of the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark was forced by the Treaty of Kiel to cede the territory of Norway in its entirety to Sweden, but was allowed to keep the Norwegian dependencies of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. With just this one treaty, the nearly 500-year-long union between Denmark and Norway was broken, and the Faroe Islands for the first time in almost 800 years were left in the hands of a new sole sovereign. Fast forward to the 20th century and World War II. The Faroe Islands come under British occupation while Denmark is being occupied by Nazi Germany. After the Allies defeat Germany and the rest of the Axis powers for good in 1945, Denmark begins to recover from years of Nazi occupation and gains back control of the Faroe Islands. During the war, though, the Faroe Islands remained under the control of the United Kingdom, during which time they were granted a high level of autonomy by the UK government. This must have greatly appealed to the Faroese population because in 1946, when a referendum was held for the Faroese to decide whether the Faroe Islands should secede from Denmark, the answer was yes, albeit not by a landslide margin. In response to this, Denmark annulled the results of the referendum by temporarily dissolving the Faroese parliament, the Lagting.
Okay.
Thankfully though, Denmark then granted the Faroe Islands broad self-governance shortly thereafter in the Home Rule Act of 1948. The Home Rule Act restored the Lagting as a legislative body with authority over certain competences on the Faroe Islands. This included things like resource management and environmental preservation, taxation, social security, education, as well as, to a certain extent, concluding trade deals and other agreements with foreign countries. Though it wouldn't be until later that the Faroes would be allowed to enter into such agreements without the cooperation of Denmark. Of course, since the Faroe Islands were still an overseas territory of Denmark, there were several governmental fields that the Home Rule Act didn't give the Lagting authority over. The most significant of these included defense and foreign policy, currency and monetary matters, immigration and border control, as well as, to a broad extent, the justice system. To better understand what happened to the Faroe Islands after World War II, it's necessary to go back and look at what the Faroes sustained themselves on for most of their history. Up until, and even after the turn of the 20th century, the Faroe Islands sustained themselves mostly in basic agriculture, some fishing, but most of all, raising sheep. In fact, to this day, the number of sheep on the Faroe Islands outnumber the actual population there by roughly 1.5, with the current number of sheep on the islands estimated at somewhere over 80,000, while the actual population of the Faroe Islands is around 53,000. They are called the Faroeyjar after all, or the Sheep Islands, a name given to them by the Norse Vikings who settled the islands after the Irish settlers fled. And, as mentioned before, for many years, the Faroes traded anything they could produce on their own for imported goods from other countries, including wool and many woolen products. Dried fish and other marine products were traded as well, but most of the emphasis was placed on what could be produced with the help of the many sheep living all over the islands. It's the reason why Faroese wool was even referred to as the gold of the Faroe Islands in the centuries before the 1900s. But by the end of the 19th century, and especially after gaining greater autonomy in 1948, the Faroe Islands took a different route in the post-war period and began to intensely develop their now staple industries of fishing and marine aquaculture, as well as greatly increase their exports of fish and other marine products. In the beginning, things were comparatively slow to develop. The Faroes were forced to fish mainly in Icelandic waters since they couldn't yet compete with foreign ships fishing in Faroese waters. However, things started to really pick up for the Faroes in the 60s and 70s when an increase in the Faroese fishing zone from 3 to 12 nautical miles and then from 12 to 200 nautical miles from the Faroese coast meant that the Faroe Islands now had complete control over their own waters. This was absolutely necessary for the further development of the Faroese fishing and aquaculture industries, as the Faroese waters are one of the most robustly diverse and productive fishing zones in the entire world. It's like this thanks to the Faroe Islands' geographically blessed position as an archipelago in the northeast Atlantic Ocean, right in the middle of the path of the Gulf Stream, which brings in warm water all the way from the Gulf of Mexico northeast into the Atlantic Ocean. All around the Faroe Islands, the warm Gulf waters from the south meet with the icy Arctic waters from the north to create an environment perfect for harboring a huge amount of diverse fish species. These include ground fish such as cod, pelagic fish, that is, fish that avoid both the sea bottom and the shore, such as herring, various prawn species such as shrimp, as well as anadromous fish such as Atlantic salmon. Additionally, multiple bilateral and multilateral trade agreements with many Nordic and non-Nordic countries mean that nowadays the Faroe Islands have access to fishing zones ranging from the Flemish Cap off the coast of Newfoundland and Canada to the Barents Sea near Russia. Though it's worth noting that there have been many instances of countries closing off their waters to Faroese fishermen due to concerns of overfishing. Finally, the Faroes are also able to set their own fishing quotas independent of EU regulations, which many nearby EU nations simply cannot do. The answer as to why the Faroe Islands are allowed to make their own rules outside of EU regulations, while at the same time being part of an EU member state, can be traced back to when Denmark first joined the EU back in 1973, or as it was known back then, the European Economic Community. On January 1st, 1973, the first enlargement of the European Economic Community, or EEC, officially took place, when Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom all joined the EEC, raising the total number of member states from 6 to 9. Since then, the United Kingdom has renounced its membership, but Ireland and Denmark still remain members. The Faroe Islands, however, evoking their rights to self-determination under the Home Rule Act, opted out and decided not to join the EEC with Denmark. The main reason for this was the EEC's Common Fisheries Policy, which regulated fishing quotas as well as set various rules for the fishing and aquaculture industries of its member states, and at the time didn't seem to the Faroe Islands to lend themselves well to their fishing and aquaculture industries, which were responsible for the majority of the Faroe Islands' GDP. The Common Fisheries Policy of the EU is still in place today and is still something that the Faroe Islands don't wish to abide by. The Faroe Islands' decision not to join the EEC, which was later integrated into the greater European Union, also leads to the odd scenario where, to this day, people born in the Faroe Islands do not receive EU citizenship upon birth, despite being citizens of Denmark, an EU country whose citizens are all entitled to EU citizenship by birthright. However, separate agreements between the Faroese government, the EU, and some European countries outside of the EU guarantee that Faroese citizens still get to enjoy free movement within the Schengen area and vice versa, which includes all of the member states of the EU, except for 2, Ireland and Cyprus, as well as 4 non-member states, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. Although the 20th century marked the beginning of a long period of rapid development for the Faroe Islands fishing and aquaculture industries, as well as a slew of economic growth, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Just a couple decades later, after the first enlargement of the EEC in 1973, the Faroe Islands experienced the worst financial crisis of its modern history that lasted nearly throughout the entire 1990s. A combination of overfishing by the Faroes in the 1980s in an attempt to prove Faroese economic viability, which depleted viable Faroese fish stocks in Faroese waters, as well as a series of unsustainable loans taken out by many private Faroese citizens and banks that caused many of them to default on their debt, eventually led to the overall sovereign debt of the nation to rise significantly, sovereign debt being the amount of debt owed by the government itself. Both the Faroe Islands and Denmark pointed fingers and attempted to shift the blame from themselves onto the opposing side. The Faroese government argued that they had taken on too much debt after being forced by Denmark to take over private Faroese banks that could no longer pay back their creditors and had defaulted on their debts. But the Danish government argued that the Faroes were the ones who had been irresponsible in taking out loans that they could not pay back, and that Denmark's AAA credit rating, whatever that means, should not have been used as leverage to get approval for the loans that many Faroese took out in the first place. Whatever the case, Denmark did eventually help the Faroe Islands escape its debt crisis after a settlement between the Faroese and Danish governments in early 1998 awarded the Faroe Islands 1.5 billion Danish krone to help the Faroes pay off their debts, which at the time was equal to around $216 million. However, even before receiving financial aid from Denmark, the Faroe Islands already beginning in 1995 saw a noticeable increase in their per capita GDP thanks to increased catch rates of fish stocks that had recovered from the aforementioned overfishing in the 80s. This upward trend continued steadily, almost without interruption, throughout nearly all the early 2000s, dropping by only a small amount in 2009 from an equivalent of about $51,000 to around $47,000. By the mid-2010s, the per capita GDP of the Faroe Islands had reached an equivalent of over $60,000 for the first time in its history. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic starting in 2020, this number kept on rising, and in 2021 peaked at an equivalent of just a little over $69,000, making the Faroe Islands one of the richest nations per capita GDP in the world. In fact, if the Faroe Islands were a completely independent country, they would statistically be the 10th richest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP. This would coincidentally just barely put them only one place behind the official 9th richest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP, Denmark, who itself is just one spot behind another one of its former colonies, Iceland. As we have seen, the 21st century so far has been a time of impressive economic growth and expansion for the Faroe Islands, but that's not all. Many important political developments have taken place as well. In 2005, new legislature was passed in cooperation with the Danish government that expanded Faroese autonomy and moved them even closer towards de facto independence. This new legislature was called the Foreign Policy Act, which, for the first time, granted the Faroe Islands the freedom to independently enter into free trade deals and other agreements with foreign countries without the cooperation or intervention of Denmark. This included not only relations with EU countries and 9 EU member states in Europe, but with countries outside of Europe as well. And since the Faroe Islands are not a part of the EU, they're also free to trade with countries that the EU has laid sanctions against, and vice versa, if they so choose. In short, complete diplomatic freedom with a few exceptions. Just as it was with the Home Rule Act in 1948, there were still many parts of government that the Faroes did not receive authority over. They were, and still are, an overseas territory of Denmark after all. Once again, this included things like defense policy and security, currency and other monetary matters, border control and immigration policy, and still, to a large extent, the justice system. But still, this new act granted the Faroe Islands greater financial and economic freedom than they had ever had before while under Denmark's rule. Shortly after the Foreign Policy Act was passed, another bill was signed into law called the Takeover Act, also in 2005, which was something like a supplement to the Home Rule Act and the Foreign Policy Act. It was like a supplement because instead of explicitly granting the Faroe Islands authority over specific competences, like taxation or social security in the case of the Home Rule Act, or the ability to negotiate freely with foreign countries as stated in the Foreign Policy Act, the Takeover Act simply gave the Faroe Islands the option to assume control of, or take over, certain fields of government currently under the authority of the Danish government. For example, some fields of government that were made available by the Takeover Act for the Faroe Islands to assume control over are the police, immigration and border control, as well as financial regulation. However, the Takeover Act still didn't give the Faroe Islands the ability to assume control over more consequential fields of government, like defense policy and security, currency and monetary matters, a large portion of the justice system again, and so on. Basically, the Takeover Act gives the Faroe Islands permission to assume control over any governmental field not already under Faroese authority that isn't explicitly forbidden by the Home Rule Act, Foreign Policy Act, or indeed the Takeover Act itself in conjunction with the Danish Constitution. But while this legislation might have further increased Faroese autonomy under Danish sovereignty, what about actual independence for the Faroe Islands? Well, there's actually quite a bit of discussion surrounding this subject today in Faroese society. It's reflected heavily, for instance, in Faroese politics and political parties, which are primarily split along where they stand on the independence issue. At the moment, there are 7 major political parties in the Faroe Islands, but currently just 4 of them have the majority of the influence in the Faroese government. These 4 major parties are Folkeflokkurin, the People's Party, Sambandsflokkurin, the Union Party, Javnaðarflokkurin, the Social Democratic Party, and Tjóðveldi, Republic, sometimes referred to as the Republican Party in English. Of the 33 total seats that make up the Lagting, the Faroese parliament, these 4 parties together currently occupy 28, or around 85%. The Social Democratic Party holds 9 seats and the Union Party 7, while the People's Party and Republic both hold 6. The other 3 smaller parties have just 5 representatives combined, or about 15%. But, as we'll find out in just a moment, one of them actually arguably holds more power than the other 2 smaller parties as well as 2 of the larger parties. In addition to the 33 seats in the Lagting though, the Faroe Islands, along with Greenland, also get to elect 2 representatives to sit in the Danish parliament, the Folketing. Their job is to represent the Faroe Islands and address the needs most concerning to the Faroese in Denmark. Right now, one of these representatives comes from the Social Democratic Party and the other from the Union Party. The current Prime Minister of the Faroe Islands, or Løgmaður, literally lawman, is Axel Vilhelmsson Johannesson, who represents the Social Democratic Party. Johannesson, as well as the rest of the members currently in the Lugting, were all elected to their current positions in December of 2022. You can see Johannesson pictured here in the back of this post-election photo op. Coalitions are also a common practice in Faroese politics, and currently, the ruling coalition that formed after the 2022 elections consists of the Social Democratic Party, Republic, as well as one of the three smaller parties, Framsókn, Progress, or the Progressive Party, which has just 3 seats in the Lugting. But given that Progress enjoys a spot on the current ruling coalition in the Faroese government, it can also count on added support from its 2 partner parties, the Social Democratic Party and Republic. Of the 3 parties to make up this coalition, just one of them, the Social Democratic Party, favors union with Denmark, while Republic and the Progressive Party both favor Faroese independence. Funnily enough, just 2 of the 7 major political parties in the Faroe Islands favor preserving the union with Denmark, the Social Democratic Party and the Union Party, but combined currently occupy 16 of the 33 seats in the Lugting, and both seats available to Faroese MPs in the Folketing. The rest of the parties favor outright independence from Denmark, except for one, kind of. The Self-Government Party, Selvstýrisflokkurin. Their platform advocates for Faroese independence achieved by gradually increasing Faroese autonomy until the Faroe Islands become an independent nation in all but name, and only then declare full independence. But they currently have no seats in the Lugting, something that hasn't happened since 1945. That leaves just Miðflokkurin, or the Center Party, which holds the remaining 2 of the 5 seats held by the smaller Faroese political parties in the Lugting. They also advocate for outright independence from Denmark. So to recap, there are currently 7 major political parties in the Faroe Islands, but just 6 parties that occupy all 33 available seats in the Lugting, the Faroese parliament. 3 of these 6 parties make up the ruling coalition, which together occupy 18 of the 33 total seats, giving them the majority. Looks nicer that way, doesn't it? The remaining 15 seats are occupied by the remaining 3 parties, which make up the opposition to the current ruling coalition led by Prime Minister Johannesson and his cabinet. Of the 18 seats held by the ruling coalition, half, or 9 of them, are held by supporters of union with Denmark, which all come from the Social Democratic Party, while the other half are held by supporters of Faroese independence, represented by Republic and Progress. And of the 15 seats held by the opposition, 7 of them are held by supporters of union with Denmark, who all represent the Union Party, while the remaining 8 seats are held by proponents of Faroese independence from the People's Party and center-right. Added up, that equates to 16 seats in favor of union with Denmark and 17 seats in favor of Faroese independence. But when you factor in Johannesson's position as Prime Minister and a representative of the Social Democratic Party, as well as the 2 Faroese representatives in the Folketing from the Social Democratic Party and Union Party, the score, so to speak, comes out to 19 to 17 across both parliaments, a narrow pro-unionist lead. So, as it stands now, it does seem unlikely that Faroese independence will be achieved under the ruling coalition of the current government. But that's not to say that the Faroe Islands won't become independent from Denmark in the future. For example, a very recent development in Faroese Nordic relations has become a topic of contention in Faroese politics, as well as in the greater Nordic realm. This being the Faroe Islands' membership in the Nordic Council, more specifically, the Faroe Islands' current inability to become a full member of the Nordic Council. Very briefly, the Nordic Council is an intergovernmental organization based in the Nordic region of Northern Europe founded in 1952 for the increased cooperation among Nordic states. Currently, they consist of 5 full members: Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, as well as 3 associated members: Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and the Åland Islands. The Åland Islands share a similar status as an autonomous region of Finland to the Faroe Islands as an autonomous territory of Denmark. The aforementioned controversy comes from earlier in 2024 when the Minister for Nordic Cooperation of the Nordic Council, Jessica Roswall from Sweden, came out against the idea that the Faroe Islands should become a full member of the Nordic Council, as they are still a part of the Danish realm and not an independent country. Finnish representatives in the Nordic Council also shared this sentiment. This was not only offensive to supporters of Faroese independence in the Faroe Islands, but to those in favor of remaining in union with Denmark, including current Faroese Prime Minister Johannesson of the Social Democratic Party. When asked about how he felt about what Roswall said regarding the Faroe Islands' status within the Nordic Council, Johannesson replied that Roswall's comments made him angry and called her speech arrogant. Many pro-unionist and pro-separatist Faroese politicians agreed with the Prime Minister's response. The reason this is so important to the Faroe Islands is that associated members of the Nordic Council lack the ability to vote on decisions taken by the Council, thereby effectively ignoring their opinions during voting. This is of course very disheartening to the Faroe Islands and its fellow associated members of the Nordic Council, Greenland and the Woolen Islands. Furthermore, in order for a proposition to pass in the Nordic Council, there must be unilateral agreement amongst the 5 full members, not just a majority. Currently, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway support full membership in the Nordic Council for the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and the Woolen Islands, while Sweden and Finland are against it. The result of Sweden and Finland blocking the Faroe Islands from becoming a full member of the Nordic Council has been a reignition of the independence question within Faroese politics. And for supporters of Faroese independence like Erling Eidsgard of the Republic and Johan Dahl of the Self-Government Party, the opposition by Sweden and Finland to the Faroe Islands' bid of becoming a full member of the Nordic Council has only exacerbated their grievances against the union with Denmark. Dahl has even threatened that the Faroe Islands should withdraw their membership in the Nordic Council completely if they are not granted equal footing with the 5 full members. Similarly, the Prime Minister of Greenland, Mutabi Egid, has presented the same ultimatum to the Nordic Council regarding Greenland's membership status. The final vote to decide on whether the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and the Woolen Islands will become full members of the Nordic Council is scheduled to be held on October 28, 2024. Depending on how the vote goes, it's possible that full membership in the Nordic Council for the Faroe Islands could quell pro-separatist attitudes among the Faroese for some time. But if rejected, it seems inevitable that they will only be swayed further towards independence. Only time will tell. Thank you for watching.